I start with an apology. I'm not an evaluator. I suppose I've been a development practitioner interested in improving the effectiveness of policies and programs that contribute to development. But in a way, it shouldn't matter that my career interest happens to have been in development. Any public servant, or indeed any interested taxpayer, citizen or CSO, should be interested in the effectiveness of policies and programs in support of objectives agreed through democratic or other accepted objective setting processes. It's fairly obvious that a lot more rigorous scrutiny is needed of important public programs in almost every country in the world. We've heard from the previous panel that the production of evidence is not a guarantee of reform, but it's surely one important element in leading to improvements over time. Public funds are a scarce resource, and their use needs objective scrutiny. And I don't apologise for emphasising this point today in this city. However, being involved in, quote, development, unquote, does involve three particular issues. First of all, our sector has probably done more evaluations of donor-supported programs than you'll find for pretty well any other form of public expenditure. And that raises rather forcefully the question of what we have managed to learn. Secondly, we may be inclined to evade evaluation judgments in a stream of finance that itself frequently contested. In other words, aid is not always a very popular way of spending public money. And this is, after all, a reason why the Centre for Global Development initiated the report entitled "When Will We Ever Learn?", which led to the establishment of 3IE. And thirdly, most programs that we finance as donors are carried out by governments or private institutions whom we do not control, but who have a lot less power and resources than we typically have to evaluate these programs or to critically assess the donor role within them. We need to consider, as donors, evaluation in this context more carefully than we often do. Also, you can't be a development practitioner without being confronted with the importance of behaviour change, whether by individuals, collectivities, economic actors, or governments. There are some technical fixes, such as vaccination, though even in that case, people have to be prepared to take the technical fix. But most objectives in development require more or less significant change of behaviour, not just in development, from improving your diet and taking more exercise to stemming losses from corruption, fraud and incompetence. So I'm interested in what encourages behaviour change. In 2009, indeed, I wrote a paper on "Do Indicators Change Behaviour?", in which I assessed the Millennium Development Goals from this perspective, perhaps with hindsight maybe a shade too critically. But I wasn't aware at that stage of the work of Conneval in doing exactly the same, in using indicators to make what appears to be rather significant behaviour change among governors of Mexican states. So the question is, if you like, can evaluation, and particularly impact evaluation, change the behaviour of policymakers? We all know about the famous evaluation of Progreso, which led to the program's survival of change of government in Mexico and its rebranding. But the fact that we still quote this example may indicate that it's rather exceptional. Addressing the issue becomes increasingly important as the volume of impact evaluations rise. 3IE has been documenting the impact of its own studies for some time. Anecdotally, it's clear the picture's mixed. 3IE can certainly point to some direct consequences, such as the rolling out of preschool programs in Mozambique or a change of policy for groundwater access for farmers in West Bengal. You'll see the document in the room. But it's clear we cannot yet make confident statements about the overall policy impact of 3IE's portfolio or of different products within it. And I suspect that those of you from other agencies and other parts of the evaluation community face similar problems. So let me consider briefly with you, based on my own experience, a few ways in which we may hope to enhance the likelihood that evaluations, and particularly impact evaluations and systematic reviews, will feed into policy. I've got 5 points to make. And the first is, quality matters. It's true that one poorly done study may be influential, dangerously influential, but evaluation units that produce or oversee the production of methodologically poor work should not expect to be influential over time. 3IE, for one, should continue to enforce rigorous standards of work without limiting itself to one methodology. And here's a suggestion. Maybe the institutions of all bilateral and multilateral agencies should submit themselves to periodic independent or peer reviews of their own quality standards to be placed in the public domain. Secondly, country ownership matters. Policymakers are much more likely, in my view, to pay attention to evaluations in whose commissioning they have played a role, though this role must not weaken the commitment to quality and independence of judgment of the evaluation. That's not to deny that there's certainly a role for evaluations commissioned by independent evaluation and scrutiny units without the agreement, or possibly against the wishes, of senior policymakers or other stakeholders. I recall the role of the IMF's Independent Evaluation Office under its first head, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who put in place a small number of evaluations of a few key and contested topics to very good effect. The United Kingdom's Independent Commission for Aid Impact is another independent institution that sets its own priority topics for review. However, I do think that the point remains relevant. One obvious example, stemming from a point I've made already, is that in the field of activities involving international aid, evaluations are far too often commissioned by donors and not enough by the governments responsible for much of the activities, or at least the context in which the activities operate. We need to turn the telescope round from getting development agencies to improve, good though that would be, to getting outcomes to improve. And that means that local stakeholders need in general to have a much larger role of the kind that we in 3IE see so clearly in members like China, Mexico or South Africa. To its credit, 3IE is increasingly assisting this through country policy windows and through its other services to members, and its new strategy, recently approved by the board, will further enhance its flexibility in delivering services relevant to countries at different levels of development, but wish to move towards assessing the outcomes attributable to their programs, whether or not supported by donors. I've mentioned the example of China. While China has, I believe, commissioned rather few formal impact evaluations as such, though 3IE has played a very positive role in encouraging such methods in China, China does have a long-standing policy of piloting new approaches before attempting to roll them out across such a large and diverse country. I happened to have the opportunity in Oxford recently of helping supervise a paper produced by a senior Chinese researcher at the Development Research Center of China. His topic was to understand how China had managed to stem losses in its huge rural cooperative credit system. It's a fascinating story, including recognition of the problem in a go-ahead province, a personal visit to the province by no less a person than the Prime Minister, the commissioning of further experimental work ahead of a return Prime Ministerial visit, and the eventual rolling out of an entirely new system which radically changed the incentives of managers at each level. What's more, the rollout gave other provinces a choice of options that suited the different levels of development across China while maintaining the essential disciplines of the new system. The point I want to stress here is the ability of China in this way to create real ownership of such reforms and how this led to effective implementation. In the same vein, just this morning, it was great to hear the World Bank praise the value of having the government as a co-principal investigator in the studies of HIV in Malawi and how this led back to quick policy action. I think that's a really good example that we should note and build on. When I was chair of the DAC, I was much involved in the Paris Declaration on aid effectiveness. It's not for nothing that the first Paris principle was indeed ownership. Donors have to do more than pay lip service to this concept if they wish to see sustainable progress in achieving results from evaluations. So I'd like to see all donor agencies set publicly a percentage of their evaluations that will be co-commissioned with the relevant southern authorities and ideally led by the latter. I predict that such evaluations will be much more influential in the countries concerned and hopefully also more honest about what both donors and local authorities could do better. My third point is that ownership by communities of practice also matters. It's not just a matter of better balance between donors and southern governments, important though that is. There's also the issue of buy-in from the technical experts who advise policymakers, Jim Kim's communities of practice and their counterparts in governments and development agencies. One feature of this globalizing world is the development of increasingly effective and coordinated international communities of practice. The OECD, where I worked, is one good example of this tendency, and the value of this approach is shown by the number of non-members who these days participate in OECD's various committees. Local context remains, of course, vitally important, but the question of what works is often something that can guide practice in many different environments. Similarly, the donor community has invested heavily in special purpose funds, from long-standing ones like UNICEF, UNFPA, IFAD and the Global Environment Facility, to this century's suite of health sector vertical funds, the Green Climate Fund and the Global Partnership for Education. If you look at 3IE product lines, one can see that evidence gap maps, thematic reviews and systematic reviews in particular, but also the new development priorities window, all have particular relevance to such communities of practice. Indeed, 3IE already has links to some of these communities, for example, the Water Supply and Sanitation Council. I think that, as the 3IE board discussed yesterday, 3IE needs to work more closely with these communities of practice, as well, of course, as with donors prepared to fund work sought and valued by the communities of practice themselves. This should not be impossible, as most funding agencies have staff forming part of many of these communities of practice. One problem is that the communities of practice may themselves fail to give sufficient attention to the potential value to themselves of, for example, systematic reviews, and 3IE probably needs to do a better job promoting such approaches. As an example, donors have spent a huge amount on attempting to develop improved cook stoves to tackle indoor air pollution. An early 3IE study of one initiative in Ghana demonstrated that not all such initiatives are successful. One study cannot, however, be generalized. I therefore looked online for a related systematic review. There are not many. I did find a couple of SRs that look at some of the factors that influence choice of fuel and technology, and one of 2012 on take-up. This one concluded that, and I quote, "Adoption studies of improved cook stoves or clean energy are scarce, scattered, and of differential quality, even though global distribution programs are quickly expanding. Future research should examine an expanded set of contextual variables to improve implementation of stove programs that can realize the triple win of health, local environmental quality, and climate associated with these technologies." That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. Yet, so far as I'm aware, donors still seem minded to conclude that the way forward is to try harder, when other evidence suggests that improved cook stoves, even when adopted, seldom deliver the health benefits deduced from experiments under laboratory conditions. I think there's a strong case for a new systematic review on the health impact of cook stove programs in practice, preceded, of course, by a gap map to assess what evidence exists for the various issues in the theory of change. I would encourage donors to the Cook Stoves Alliance to commission such a gap map as soon as possible, and I'm sure that 3IE will be happy to oblige. The effort to work more closely with international communities of practice and interested donors is surely worthwhile. A systematic review commissioned by one donor, and we've had several of those in 3IE, may or may not get serious attention of the international community of practice. One co-commissioned by the community of practice itself is much more likely to be fed back into the community concerned. Fourth, feedback matters. Developing the theme of the involvement of relevant policymakers, I'd also argue for better designed feedback loops. Here are two specific examples from my own experience in the United Kingdom's Overseas Development Administration in the 1980s and 1990s, at a time when aid was not particularly popular with the government of the day. One is to get findings to people across the institution. Given that we all move around in our careers, I think it's worth spreading information around that may be used down the line. In those pre-digital days, it was done in the UK case by a paper-based system whereby staff were issued with a special binder, green, I still remember this, and each evaluation had a one-page summary which gave the highlights of every evaluation carried out by the ODA, probably in those days a dozen or so a year. I was nerd enough to read all these. It only took a matter of minutes. That's how I first learned that water supply projects were unlikely to deliver health benefits without some complementary investment in health information. A year or so after picking up this piece of knowledge, I was sitting in the World Bank board as the UK alternate executive director, looking at an engineering-based water supply project in West Africa with absolutely no health inputs at all. So at least I managed to get 1 point over to the mighty bank. It may ironically be harder to pull off such user-friendly systems in a digital age where everyone's exposed to vast quantities of relevant and irrelevant information. But I think it's not impossible to get out key lessons efficiently, particularly from evaluations that are more than one-off, which may, of course, be weak on external validity. And I thought that the IRC had a beautiful example earlier on how to do that. The second is to have the same people who approve major new programs also look properly at the results of the evaluations that their agency at least has commissioned. In the ODA, this was done by having all the evaluations submitted to the same senior committee that advised the minister on all new commitments above the delegated authority level. If nothing else, this provided a clear feedback loop to those with authority in the system. Again, it was easier with fewer evaluations. But there should be ways of getting the results of evaluations by some means or other to the senior levels of an agency, whether a development agency or that of a government. I also like the approach of some donors, and I give the Children's Investment Fund Foundation as an example I came across, who require all expenditure proposals to begin with a brief survey of the evaluation evidence for the intervention in question. I think this is a piece of good practice that could be readily rolled out across agencies. So I'd like to see all development agencies, and indeed this could go much wider to government agencies in general, to require consideration of existing knowledge from evaluations before taking decisions on major new activities, to ensure that those taking major financing decisions also have a formal role in studying new evaluation findings, and that very short summaries of all evaluations and particular syntheses of evaluation evidence are widely distributed within their agencies. Finally, results matter. Final reflection on the donor community. With increasing scrutiny of the effectiveness of development spending, something that we should welcome, donors have often responded by stronger assertions about the results which this spending is achieving. These claims, in my opinion, can often be misleading. Donors taking credit for outputs, say classrooms built, even when outcomes, say better literacy of school leavers, are not achieved, or alternatively claiming credit for outcomes even when the intervention itself had been ineffective and the outcome is the result of progress unrelated to the project. And any of you who've listened to Howard White on the World Bank's Bangladesh Nutrition Project will readily recall that example. Worse, too narrow a focus on the measurable may inhibit risk-taking or the adoption of more effective but less readily quantifiable approaches. One problem is the lack of common understanding, in my opinion, between the impact evaluation community and those who specialize in management by results or management for results. The two, in my view, should be natural allies, as both are or should be concerned at establishing whether any particular theory of change is effective in practice. Attribution of outcomes to interventions cannot be securely demonstrated without a counterfactual. So anyone interested in results management should also be an advocate of rigorous evaluation of impact. So I would like the two communities to address together ways of presenting the synergies between the insights of each in a much more compelling way to policymakers. So, as I step down from the position of chair of the 3IE board, I'd like to end by just saying a word about the direction that 3IE is taking under its new strategy. This maintains 3IE's commitment to improving lives through evidence derived from rigorous but mixed methods appropriate to context, and especially in areas where there are gaps in knowledge and a lack of evidence in particular countries and regions among low and middle income countries. And I'd like to stress here that 3IE is not an RCT factory. The strategy has a stronger focus on take-up of evidence and includes support for a better enabling environment to generate and use high-quality evidence, including through its services to the wider community, such as its repository of impact evaluations, now containing almost 5,000 searchable studies. One thing that makes 3IE special is its member-based structure. In the last 5 years, membership has grown from the low 20s to around 50, with southern governments and institutions tripling in numbers from 10 to 30, and I really welcome that. It's very evident from the meetings this week, and from the many informal discussions outside the meetings, what a significant community of practice this is becoming, both among southern members and also among all members and other agencies, as you have been hearing today. In response to the growth and diversity of membership, y compris nos amis français, francophones, 3IE is building in more flexible ways of cooperating with its southern members. For example, through supporting formative evaluations in countries where these are a valuable precursor to impact evaluations as such, and being ready to work with partners to help put in place systems that are needed if impact evaluations are to be successfully commissioned down the line. Consistently with what I've been saying, 3IE emphasizes host country ownership and is also experimenting with support programs both at sub-regional and sub-national level. We're also discussing how we can broaden our relevance to northern governments and non-official institutions beyond the core group of committed organizations from whose support we have benefited. Equally, the strategy encourages the development of closer ties with international communities of practice, particularly for its synthesis products, including its innovative gap maps. 3IE was created out of the concern that the world was short of evidence about the success or otherwise of major programs. Along with other agencies, 3IE has made a lot of progress in generating and synthesizing such evidence, including more recently under our development priorities window in areas where rigorous evidence is particularly thin. There's still much more to do in generating evidence, but I fully support the greater focus now being given to the use of this growing body of evidence, and I see 3IE, with its long-standing commitment to linking evidence to policy, as one of the key contributors to moving this forward. Finally, I'd like to express my thanks to my fellow commissioners who bring enormous experience, engagement and enthusiasm to guiding and promoting 3IE, to Manny Jimenez, his senior management team, and 3IE staff in its offices in Delhi, London and here in Washington for their commitment and creativity, and a particular thanks to all those involved in arranging the meetings here this week. I'd like to express my thanks to all 3IE members who have shown their common dedication to the generation and use of evidence, and also to Ruth Levine, who replaces me as chair in June. Ruth's passion for usable evidence was absolutely key to the establishment of 3IE, and she brings to the position of chair huge credibility among all who care about evidence-based policy. Thank you.